To welcome everybody, of course, and thank you all for attending. I am particularly pleased with the turnout today and the interest in our important work. I would like to open our webinar today by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. An important step in reconciliation is our acknowledgement of traditional lands. The Coalition for Canadian Police Reform is a national nonprofit corporation with one primary vision: to elevate the police profession in Canada. Our mission is to see the creation of a college, or perhaps better described as a national center of police excellence, uniquely designed for Canada and established by a special act of Parliament. The center would be responsible for the development of national, current, and relevant training and education standards for all entry-level police officers, including the development of a national certification protocol, all to be administered by the provinces. There have been countless studies, reports, commissions, and public inquiries recommending modernizing police education and research in Canada, and that Public Safety Canada work with the provinces and territories to establish a credible certificate or degree-based entry-level program. We are here today because of many of you support elevating the police profession to ensure that the curricula are current, relevant, and evidence-based across the country. I must say, I was very encouraged when I read a Blue Line article recently authored by one of our panelists today, Sergeant Brian Nikon from the Vancouver Police Department. In this article, Brian described the need to improve control tactics training, and as a use of force instructor, he describes how the current inconsistent training model must be standardized and guided by science and research. This and many other current and relevant subjects must be designed to deliver to our police officers and delivered to our police officers to ensure that they have the benefit of credible instruction in order to provide the best possible policing service to all Canadians. Regrettably, much of the 6-month training program provided to our police officers today is too short, too subjective, very inconsistent from one department to another, and without any meaningful standards. Today's session is planned for no more than 90 minutes in length. I would ask you to participate in the discussion and submit your questions and comments in the chat. Our moderator will draw from these questions. At the conclusion of the webinar, Dr. John Lilly, our Vice President, will highlight a couple of important issues. I am now particularly pleased to welcome and introduce our moderator today, Detective Staff Sergeant Les Titleman of the York Regional Police. As moderator, Les will welcome and introduce our 3 panelists. Les is an award-winning police leader with 26 years of experience in organized crime investigations, special investigations, major projects, and major collision investigations. Les specializes in case management, wiretap investigations, as well as technical collision investigations. He was previously the officer in charge of the York Regional Police Gangs, Guns and Drug Enforcement Unit, the Major Projects Unit, the High Risk Offender Unit, the Mobile Surveillance Unit, and currently the Criminal Investigation Bureau for the City of Markham. He is a Level 3 certified municipal manager and a Level 2 technical investigator. Les also holds a master's degree in leadership from the University of Guelph and a bachelor's degree in criminology from the University of Toronto. And I can see by that resume that Les does not lack any operational experience. Staff Sergeant Titleman is also a very active member of our Operations Committee, of which I am most appreciative. Welcome, Les, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dave. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome to all our guests. I notice we have a number of esteemed guests and retired police service members that have given plenty of years of service to the cause along the way, so I appreciate everybody that's in attendance. We are very honored to have a couple of guest speakers today that are going to take our understanding to a new level. The first speaker, as Dave mentioned, Sergeant Brian Nikon, currently works for the Vancouver Police Department Professional Standards Section, and he is the incoming sergeant for the Officer Safety Control Tactics Team. His policing experience is in patrol, community policing and training, where he was the lead use of force instructor. Brian holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from the University of British Columbia and a Master's of Arts in Conflict Resolution from Bradford University in the UK, where he was a Rotary Peace Scholar. Outside of policing, he teaches conflict resolution at Langara College and coaches judo at the Stevenson Judo Club. Now, as Dave mentioned, Brian's a recent author for a Blue Line magazine, like a journal article that John has posted the link to. I'm grateful to welcome you, Brian, from the other coast. I'm in Ontario, and I'm waiting to hear what you have to tell us about, some of your adventures along the way, learning about training and teaching. And we're going to follow up our program today with a couple of very studious professors and the like. So it's all going to be intertwined. You know what's coming after you. So we'll get you to go ahead and start. And thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks for the intro, Les, and thanks for having me here today. When you write an article and you're not sure if anyone ever reads it, it's nice to see that, people did, and I got a lot of feedback as soon as it was published. I think a lot of people are thinking the same things, which is a good sign for me. I think that there's no doubt that we do have insufficient training for use of force in particular. I think training in general is something that is not taken as seriously as it could be. And I think that if we just look at the amount of hours that police officers are given for training use of force, and we compare that with evidence-based research on how humans learn motor skills, how they retain it, and how they perform it under stress, we need to provide more training. So the impetus for the article was actually kind of a good news story of an example for how we've dealt with this issue with the Vancouver Police Department. And our chief authorized some additional training. So we essentially doubled the amount of use of force training that all recruits from the Vancouver Police Department get at the police academy. So there's a provincial police academy here, in case you guys didn't know, it's the Justice Institute of British Columbia. And once they come, they graduate from the police academy, they come to the VPD, and we have an opportunity to give them some additional training. So about 80 hours of additional use of force training, and then ongoing training, which is also really, really important. I made myself a few notes. I'll try not to look down too much, but what I want to talk about today essentially is I'm going to ask 3 questions. So what makes a good use of force learner? What makes a good use of force curriculum? And what makes a good use of force instructor? And I think by having these headings or these topics, we'll be able to dive into some of the bigger, more important issues. So the issues are more broad than just more training. A lot of times I've heard the kind of argument that, yeah, we need more training. It's not necessarily more training, but it's very targeted training and science-based training. So how we actually decide on what a curriculum is very, very important. Before I jump too much into the curriculum and a good example of what we've done in the Vancouver Police Department, I want to look at the learners. So who are the people that are signing up to be police officers? Who are the recruits that are going to the police academy? And what are their pre-existing skill sets? So having done use of force training for almost 7 years now, I've seen everything. So you see some people, they come, they arrive, they've got previous military experience. They've got people that have martial arts training and are very, very comfortable going hands-on or using force. Other people that have played high-level sports, but that doesn't necessarily translate to being comfortable putting hands on a violent subject, and others that have zero experience. And so that last group obviously is a challenging one for us because of a general lack of physical literacy that would have existed in what I believe would be like previous generations, where people were outside doing more sports, climbing trees, wrestling with each other, as opposed to being on screens, which is what our society has kind of gone towards recently. So you've got this 3 different levels of of people coming in, and you've got one curriculum. So how do you match that? How do you get everyone to a base level where they're able to use force appropriately? So that's making decisions, and that's performing a tactic or a maneuver, always considering the duty of care. So there's problems with each of those categories. If someone that came from a martial arts background that isn't necessarily focused on duty of care poses a lot of issues for risk of injury, not just to the subject, but to the officer. Optics, like it's not okay for us to be doing striking. Like there's a lot of things that have changed over the years. We'll get into more of that in the curriculum phase of this talk, but I think that depending on where you're coming from, you might have to do retraining. So that's also a consideration. But what intrinsically makes a good learner? So if I think about, okay, what are all the students that I've had in the past that have really excelled and done well at their use of force training and then been able to do the job efficiently on the road? It has to do with like a desire to learn. So people have to be willing when they're on the mats. It's not begrudgingly being told what to do and doing a few reps and then being done with it. It's this spirit of wanting to learn because they're professionals, because you want to be the best that you can be at your job. So that's something that's really important for learners. Willingness to work hard. It's hard work to train use of force, train how to manage somebody who's being violent without escalating to a higher level of force than necessary. You sweat, you get injuries. There's all kinds of issues that come with use of force training, but you have to have that will to fight through it and work hard. And then also an understanding that training cannot end when you pass a use of force panel exam or you graduate from the police academy. So like any skill set, it requires ongoing training. So you have to have refresher training. A lot of times if an agency doesn't have that set up, then it's your own initiative. So some people will go seek out extra training. And I really respect that. And those are the people that are your go-to people on any squad, on a patrol squad, because they're confident and competent with their use of force skills. So when I think of curriculum, so how is your average police department's curriculum built? There's a lot of standards that are in place for every province for what needs to be done every year. So for firearms, of course, you have a qual that you need to pass every year. In British Columbia, we need to requalify on our vascular neck restraint, use of baton and OC, and our CID skills. The problem with the strictly focusing a curriculum on qualifications is that that's not the same as learning. So a lot of times you're mirroring a motor activity without actually learning it. This is a phenomenon that you see all over the place where you're just kind of cramming for an exam and you pass the exam and then whew, fantastic, that was great. I passed, but did you actually absorb anything? Or are you taking anything with you for when you're under stress and have to perform these skills in an environment that is very different from a safe training gym, right? So building a good curriculum, we need to factor all of that in. There's been a lot of progress recently as far as how curriculums are moving away from blocked training and towards, or siloed training and towards interleaved training. So making sure that we're not just focusing on one skill without considering the fact that we're going to have to consider many things. So while you're using force, you're also considering your communication tactics. You're also considering your legalities, and whether or not you are breaching any of your RPMs or legal authorities. So all of these things need to be trained together so that we're not separating them to the point where officers can perform a certain task, but out of context, it disappears. So interleave training is something that's been important, and we've really embraced that at the VPD. So when we think of how you teach a new skill, so first it needs to be shown. So a skill has been demonstrated to the learner, it needs to be practiced, has to be repeated many times, and then it needs to be, assessed by an instructor. So the instructor can be there during the assessment and the repetitions, and then we need to actually put it into a context. So at first, in Vancouver, we're lucky we have about 100 role players that come to all training, and they can provide light resistance at first, all the way up to force-on-force reality-based training scenarios where you're applying the technique that you learned earlier in the day under stress. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, no, I see. I think Les is dealing with some questions that are happening there. I'll just continue. Yeah, someone give me a thumbs up. Too much talking. Okay. So, but the most important thing, like I said before, is that you don't touch on a new technique once in a cycle training and then never see it again for 4 or 5 years. That's not the way we learn. We need to actually repeat the techniques under stress in reality-based training scenarios and do it on a regular basis so that we actually have it when we need it. That's the same for every skill set, not necessarily just use of force. Okay, and then I think about what makes a good use of force instructor. So who is teaching your recruits or your in-service training, and why were they selected? So a lot of times you'll have an officer who's very, very proficient. So maybe they're very good at use of force, but not necessarily always good with the teaching skill set or the right demeanor for training. So those are things that we need to consider when selecting our team. We can build on the skill sets for teaching. For us, once we select an instructor, they come and do some shadowing. They're sent on a 3-week standardized use of force instructor course that the province actually hosts through the JI. And when they come back, they're mentored by a senior instructor. Eventually, we'll send them on a methods of instruction course or something of the equivalent, something like Chris Butler or Force Science Institute hosts. So we actually have proper methodologies behind what we're teaching and why. I think that there's sometimes you'll see a department will really latch on to our particular type of martial art, let's say. In our case, judo, but judo mixed with control tactic skills. So it's not sport-based judo, it's contextual judo for controlling someone without causing any harm to themselves or the subject. But if your use of force instructors are based on another martial art like Krav Maga or striking or karate, you're going to see more and more of the striking and less of the consideration for duty of care. So that's something you have to be aware of. Obviously, trainers can learn new skill sets, and if they're a good trainer, you can do a train the trainer course, and that's something that we've been working on as well to make sure that we've got consistency through the years. Whether or not that consistency goes through the country, that's kind of yet to be seen. We have done some training outside of the VPD across Canada, and actually done some police judo clinics in Europe as well. But I would highly recommend the methods of instruction course taught by Chris Butler, and making sure that there's up-to-date training. So once you become an instructor, you still, like the learners, need to do refresher training and make sure that you're doing everything appropriately. For myself, I've been doing judo for 36 years. I was coaching for 20 years. I'm an NCCP coach, and I have 10 years of experience as a college instructor. So I have a certain skill set, but maybe my strongest attribute is that I love teaching. I love teaching judo. I love teaching use of force, and I have a passion for building officer competence and confidence. So I think that's a crucial factor. People that have that desire to learn and teach and share is crucial for how you're selecting your use of force instructors. So those are the 3 kind of categories that I thought I would start with to kind of build some discussion, and maybe we'll move on from here. Les, does that work for you?
Yes, thanks, Brian. So I want to move us along. That was a great starting point for us. There's a couple of points that are important in consideration of what C-CPR is promoting, and the way that we have had discussions in the past at some of our previous webinars, and some of the topics have to do with where the crossover between the practical hands-on training, for example, what you just discussed, against the backdrop of the academics. So I noticed that Bruce posted an interesting comment there, and I would say it's quite valid. And to contextualize some of what you have said, Brian, in terms of the macro for C-CPR viewers, is you have given us a perspective from your home province and your experiences with your police service. And it's important to note that you're very supportive of your service and the way that they go about training their officers. And so there's no criticisms here of the different police services over the different provinces. But what we have recognized is that the curriculums are all different, and we are not certain what the basis for each one is. And so this is the point. This is the crucial tie-in for us at C-CPR, is the basic standards throughout the nation. So the other thing I wanted to mention was when it comes to the hands-on use of force practitioners, I'm sure that we've all experienced, because of the accessibility of YouTube, for example, you could watch every single day, you could watch a different police shooting in the United States. And one of the things that I've noticed in watching them is they have usually, in most instances, they have great tactics as far as their hands-on, and they do a lot of physical training and they do a lot of tactical training. It appears that they do anyway. And then what I ask in the back of my mind is, every time they shoot someone, are they justified in their actions? And I think the difference between the States and here, as far as all those shootings, is they're often readily justified in their actions based on their laws and the way that they engage. But just because it might be lawful doesn't mean it's something that we want to do. And so that's a good segue for us to start talking about de-escalation. So we start off with Brian with our tactics and the need to have an understanding about that. And we're going to start going into de-escalation tactics, and the more of the verbals and more of the knowledge base that comes from the academics. And with that, I would like to introduce Tori Semple. So Tori is a PhD student in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa, where she works in the Police Research Lab, which I find absolutely remarkable because I never knew there was a police service lab. And it has a great title. So she's doing research which examines de-escalation and use of force, with particular focus on police interactions with people with mental illness, and how specialized training or models of response can be used and implemented to improve those interactions. So I think it's important, the little blurb I gave ahead of introducing Tori is, we likely all know about use of force unfolding, in horrible situations where force is used and people get injured or lives are lost. And we know that, I think, there's a great push in Canada to move towards de-escalation, and the research that's being done is remarkable. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tori and have her tell us how she arrived at doing the studies that she's currently engaged in and the research that she's conducting. And she's done quite a lot of review on previous research that's been published, other journal documents and things like that on police conflict management, practical things like that. So without further, Tori, you are up.
Thanks, Les, for the introduction. And I don't know if you can just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, John. Sorry, I just speak very softly, so I'm very mindful of that. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. Like Les mentioned, I'm actually a PhD candidate. I'm almost done. I'm very excited. But yeah, so I've worked for about 8 years under the supervision of Dr. Craig Bunnell, who you'll hear shortly. And over this time, my research has really looked at a wide variety of topics that are generally related to use of force and de-escalation. And that really led myself and my colleagues to write several different research papers looking at how we can actually apply research to improving training in general and de-escalation kind of based training in particular. So today I'm going to highlight what the research kind of says about the effectiveness of de-escalation training. And then I'm going to just get into some key points for effectively developing and delivering training based on research from a variety of different domains. So, adult learning, the sports context, and from the development of expertise literature a little bit as well. So, when we're thinking about de-escalation training, we often hear kind of renewed and quite pervasive calls for increased use of de-escalation and increased training related to de-escalation for police officers following high-profile use of force incidents involving police and members of the public. So despite these calls, the research actually suggests, as well as kind of anecdotal experience, that many police agencies across North America have implemented some form of de-escalation training, or they've actually argued that they've, taught de-escalation for quite a long time. So, despite this, we actually have very little sense of how effective these training programs are in terms of the key outcomes that we hope that they're actually, influencing, like reducing use of force, for example. We have very limited evaluations of de-escalation training, but those that do exist demonstrate that while they are generally effective at improving officer knowledge and kind of attitudes, we're not often seeing the kind of behavioral outcomes we want. So the reductions in force, reductions in injuries to officers, as well as to members of the public. So, based on the research that is available, it's really suggesting that the outcomes that we want to see from de-escalation training are unfortunately not being fully realized. So this is likely due to a variety of different factors. One of them is certainly training time, which, Brian kind of mentioned. But I do think there are other factors as well, many of which he actually already spoke to, which is awesome. So there is, going to be overlap throughout our 3 different sections, which is great because I think it really is emphasizing some key points. So in particular, like the other factors that I think are related to the effectiveness of de-escalation training actually relate to how we're developing or designing our training, as well as how we're delivering it. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to briefly highlight some key overarching points from this research that I really think can be used to help training development and delivery. But, truly there are so many other points that we just don't have time to go through today, unfortunately. But I would encourage anyone to kind of reach out at a different time, and myself and Craig are happy to discuss the research further. So yeah, in terms of kind of key points, the first one is that when we're thinking about police training, we are ultimately dealing with adult learners. This is super important to acknowledge because adult learners are really different from children, right, and child learners. So with adults, we know that they need to understand, like we all need to understand the value of what we're learning and how it actually applies to, a given context that we're trying to learn it for. So we know that officer experiences, their previous life experiences or their previous experiences on the job actually influence how they learn new material. So given these things about adult learners, the use of kind of problem-based approaches where you have information that you're learning actually being directly introduced in the context of real-world situations are particularly useful. So, in my experience and that of Craig's, we've certainly found that there's a lot of broad support within the law enforcement community for scenario-based training, which is awesome because this is certainly an example of problem-based learning. However, I think an area that does require a little bit more attention is bringing more problem-based approaches into the classroom. So, sometimes there is a need to deliver information like foundational concepts by PowerPoint. But I think there's a lot of missed opportunities where problem-based exercises really could be implemented into the classroom to make learning more engaging and relevant. And it really offers officers an opportunity to apply their knowledge to an application setting, which actually makes it more, increases the likelihood that the learning will transfer to the field, which is ultimately what we're trying to aim for, right? So what this could look like is, breaking officers into groups and having them apply, something they've just learned to a given problem or situation they might face in the real world. And yeah, this can be done. They're kind of called tabletop exercises, for example. Okay, so in line with kind of the idea of wanting to make training, meaningful for our officers, relevant to their job, we really want training to be reflective of reality. And one way that we can actually do this is by leveraging operational data. So to develop training. So in my experience, a lot of agencies, especially larger ones, actually collect a lot of operational data, particularly now with the implementation of body-worn cameras across the country. So all of this data that's being collected presents a lot of opportunities in a training context. So for example, in the past, my colleagues and I have actually conducted analyses on use of force reports, and we were actually able to identify different trends that could then be used to develop training. So for one example is just kind of seeing a prevalence of low light conditions in use of force situations and recognizing that there may be a need to train further in those environments. Okay, so next, and Brian talked about this, is that training is often blocked, or at least historically has been blocked, and using those interleaving approaches that Brian talked about, super important. So I won't kind of go over it in the same detail again, but what I will say is that the research certainly suggests that interleaving or interspersing skills in this way is associated with better learning, as well as transfer to the field and to a variety of different settings. So super important. Next, training should be able to be tailored to officers that are of different skill levels. So Brian alluded to officers coming to that initial training, they have a variety of different experiences. I think that's absolutely true for initial training, but to some extent, I think it's actually true for in-service training as well. So it's applicable to both of these different settings. So, we know not all officers are coming with the same strengths and weaknesses, and we need to have training that actually is able to address these different skill levels in order to enhance learning. So, one example of how this could be done in the context of scenario-based training is designing in ways to make a given kind of scenario more complex if you have a more skilled learner. So some agencies will actually require like their highly trained tactical officers to go to their basic in-service training. And if you're delivering the same kind of training or the same scenarios to these officers as you are to regular officers that are, working general patrol or general duty, the same training or the same scenario isn't as valuable to both of these different groups. So it's super important to be able to modify training to the skill level of the trainees or to the officers you're working with. And lastly, this point was also mentioned by Brian, which is awesome, is that instructors need to be good teachers and not just skilled officers. So having good training for instructors is super worthwhile. So the method of instructions course that Brian talked about, awesome example. Because ultimately we can design the best training in the world, but if it's not delivered in a way that's effective, that really, you're not getting what you want from it, right? So for example, just to highlight one of the ways that, instructors are critical is instructors are responsible for providing feedback. And we know that feedback is super important for learning. And when we think about feedback and providing feedback in a way that's likely to enhance learning, feedback needs to be the right type. So, it needs to be related to the task and not the learner, for example. It needs to be the right amount. So it needs to be focused on a couple key and straightforward points, for example. And lastly, it really needs to be delivered at an appropriate time. So for example, this is after a learner has engaged in self-reflection about their own performance, and also after they've had an opportunity to calm down, because we know training can actually be quite stressful for people. And when you're experiencing higher levels of physiological arousal, you're actually less likely to kind of take in information and then retain that information. So it's actually an impediment to learning to provide feedback at that time. So that's kind of all for me. But yeah.
Thank you, Tori. I noticed we have a couple of points in our chat that I'd like to bring up, and a couple other points that I would just wanted to mention. So I'll go through mine just quickly with you. The takeaways for adult learning, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on, through your studies, if you notice a difference with emotional intelligence as far as the people that are required to benefit from the training and the people that are delivering the training. Because as you mentioned, the different levels of experience doesn't mean that people have the different levels. They haven't mastered the emotional intelligence side of the de-escalation and dealing with people that are, having episodes of conflict and things like that. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about that really quickly.
Sorry, just to clarify, my thoughts were on like whether emotional intelligence influences people's ability in training.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not actually aware of a lot of research that's looked specifically at the role of emotional intelligence, but totally agree with you that I could see that could be something that would influence people's abilities in the context of de-escalation as well as in instructing too. But I just can't say I'm not aware of any research that's looked at it.
Okay. The other point that I noticed from both you and Brian that I have noticed in Ontario is the interspersed training is happening frequently now, and I don't know when what you see, and maybe Craig is in a better position when he speaks to us to give us some sort of range of turnaround time in terms of you are developing things in your lab and you're seeing trends, and then because we're in Ontario, because I'm also in Ontario, then we see those trends work their way into the police college in Ontario, and then you start to see it in training in Ontario. And I'll leave that up to Craig to maybe get into. I noticed that Chief Labarge, retired Chief Labarge, has made a point about adult learners versus child learners. And I know that you covered it effectively. So unless there's another question in here, I'm just quickly looking. People have made some comments on different training scenarios in Toronto, etc. I'm just going to go on, and I'm going to introduce Craig. Unless someone has a question they want to yell out for Tori, I think we're covered. Dr. Bunnell is a professor of psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa, and Tori is studying with him. He is the director of the Police Research Lab. His research is conducted in partnership with Canadian Police Services and focuses on various aspects of evidence-based policing. He's particularly interested in de-escalation and use of force in the policing context. And this, the research that he is conducting focuses on factors that influence police decision-making and strategies for trying to make improvements in that area. I think it's a great start to have Tori introduce the topics that she's been studying, and then try to go further with Dr. Bunnell. So I'm going to introduce you now, sir.
Thanks, Les. Again, thanks for the invite. I was involved in the very early days of this organization, so it's nice to be back and contributing in this way. And I appreciate all the people that have attended today. So what I thought I would do is, I've been working in this area now, working in the policing field for about 30 years, but working specifically on issues around use of force and de-escalation for about 15 years. And I thought I'd just reflect on what I see as some of the big picture issues in this field. A lot of what I say is going to be informed by a big project that we did several years ago with the Ministry of, at the time, Community Safety and Correctional Services in Ontario, where we traveled throughout Ontario, observing and assessing and evaluating the de-escalation training and use of force training that was being delivered by Ontario Police Services. And we went to very large services like Toronto, moderate-sized services like Ottawa, but also very small services like South Simcoe and also First Nation services. So we got a good sense of what the training looked like. And I've identified 10, I have 10 minutes. I have 10 big picture issues. We're going to spend 1 minute on each. Obviously, we're just going to scratch the surface of them. And really, this is just to initiate conversations at the end of this session. And also, like Tori said, if anyone would like to email me, you can find me on my website, the Police Research Lab at Carleton University. By all means, reach out and we can talk about any of these 10 issues in more detail. Like Tori said, many of these overlap with what Brian and Tori have already discussed. So it suggests that there is some real, importance around these issues, that all three of us are coming to the same conclusion that these need to be focused on. I mean, it's hard not to start with the most obvious sort of finding from the research that we did, which is the need for higher quality training around de-escalation. I think we can all agree that police services require higher quality training across the board. They're simply not receiving enough of it, not high quality enough. But I think more specifically, we need to start providing training in a way that we know maximizes learning, retention, and transfer of the skills that we're training to the field. And what's frustrating is that we actually do know what this training looks like. There's been a lot of work in other contexts. There's been a lot of work in the policing context, but a lot of work in other contexts, the sports context, the military context, where we know what this training looks like. And we also know that oftentimes the training that's offered in policing sometimes creates the illusion of learning, but doesn't create sustainable learning that is going to transfer to the field. So for example, massed practice or blocked practice, we know creates the illusion of learning. It creates very rapid learning, but that learning subsides very quickly. It isn't retained over time, and it doesn't transfer to new contexts. Things like spaced learning and interleaved learning are much, much more effective, and yet often not done in a policing context. One of the issues with this is, this idea that we know what we need to do, but we're not doing it all the time, is making sure that the research that is being done in these areas is accessible to the police community. And it's simply not, in large part because academics who are conducting this research tend to publish their work in journals and not in forums that the police community can access. So we need to get to grips with that as well, this accessibility issue. So that's the number one, the need for higher quality training. Number two, and these all relate to that issue around higher quality training. Number two is the need to clearly define what de-escalation is, so that instructors across Canada are actually training with a common goal. And it became very clear, if you look at the research literature, it's very clear that there's no agreed upon definition of de-escalation. When I was traveling across Ontario, there were certainly disagreements amongst trainers in different Ontario police services as to what de-escalation was. So it's hard to imagine a common set of training standards when we can't agree on the construct that we're actually training on. Lots of discussion around whether de-escalation was a process or an outcome. We often see in the news people talking about it as an outcome, that police officers successfully de-escalated because the outcome was good. The inference from that is that if the outcome is bad, then the de-escalation failed on the part of officers, which I think is highly problematic. So is de-escalation a process? Is it an outcome? Talking about the role of use of force within de-escalation as a de-escalation tactic, there's lots of disagreements amongst trainers as to the role of use of force as a de-escalation tactic. This can be something as simple as taking out a taser and sparking it, or using the laser sights. We know that that de-escalates the situation. We know that low levels of force, can be used to de-escalate situations and prevent further escalation. So we need to get a common understanding of the relationship between de-escalation and use of force so that we can train to a common standard. I won't harp on this too much because both Brian and Tori talked about it a lot. The need for trainers to learn how to teach. The trainers that we observed were excellent in the area of use of force and de-escalation. As practitioners, they were excellent, but there were many that did not have the foundational knowledge about how to teach and how to teach adult learners. So that's critically important. Again, in Ontario, there are courses down at the Ontario Police College I highly recommend the course that Brian and Tori mentioned, the course by Chris Butler. He's a previous Calgary police officer, now runs Raptor Protection and Safety Services. He has an excellent week-long method of instruction course that I took in a few Decembers ago when he did it to the RCMP. It's a wonderful course that is focused on teaching instructors how to teach in a way that is going to maximize learning, retention, and transfer. So I can't recommend that course enough. It's the same course that Force Science down in the States run. That's the course that was developed by Chris. Number 4, which again has been mentioned briefly and certainly in the comments, involving the community in training, development, and delivery, I think is critical. And I think the writing is on the wall that we have to start thinking about training in that way. I think we can involve the community broadly, the mental health community, racialized community members, LGBTQ2S+ community members, to be involved in designing training to make sure that we're focusing on the appropriate and important KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we want our modern contemporary police officers to know. And they can also help deliver that training as role players, as consultants, as individuals, observers, to ensure that the training is appropriate. I think this can, there's clear examples of this improving the quality of training, but it can also have one of the byproducts is that it can help enhance police community relations. It can help police services create relationships with community members to help damage some of the issues that we're currently seeing. There are really good examples of how this can be done. After I'm done talking, I'll put something in the chat. Jennifer Leroy, who's a colleague down at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, has done tremendous work designing mental health crisis response training with the community, and I think it provides a really good example of how this can be done. So that's point number 4. Point number 5 relates to the coherence or the consistency of training. And what I'm talking about here is what training looks like from the point of being a police recruit through post-recruit training at the police service they've been hired at, through their coach officer training program, through their in-service training program, and all the booster training that they'll receive throughout their career. What we observed in Ontario when we went through is that there's inconsistencies across that training for the individual officer that's going through their career. There's inconsistencies in terms of the philosophy, the approach, the goals that are trying to be achieved. And in fact, it gets worse than that. Oftentimes what we observed is that at different phases of an officer's training, some of their previous training, there's almost explicit attempts to undo it. They'll go from recruit training, say at the Ontario Police College, they'll get to their service, and there will be explicit mention of the fact that, forget what you learned there, we're going to teach you how it's done at this service. And then they'll get to the coach officers who will often say, forget what you learned there, we're going to teach you how it is on the street. We need to deal with that issue because it creates a very, we've talked to officers going through that experience, and it creates real confusion and certainly detracts from their ability to learn from the training that they're receiving. So point 5 was coherence and consistency of training. Point 6, and again, it relates to something that Brian said, but I think it's underemphasized in many different services. I work a lot with the RCMP here in Ottawa, and I think they do an exceptional job with this, but at most places, this is underdeveloped, and it's the importance of curriculum designers. Ideally, every police service would have access to curriculum designers, people with specialized expertise on how to develop training, how to identify important learning objectives, how to tie those to learning outcomes, and how to develop training to ensure that learning and learning retention and transfer is happening. I think it's a really undervalued skill. Again, RCMP headquarters here is really lucky that they have a range of people that are dedicated to that. Some of the big services also have that expertise. As much as possible, I think every service should try to engage with curriculum designers. The evidence is clear. I think that they can have a very significant and positive impact on the quality of training that's delivered. Number 7 is that I think there needs to be much more emphasis on training evaluations. And I think in 2 ways. One is the evaluations that the instructors do of the training to ensure that when that trainee walks out the door, they've learned the skills and can implement those skills in a real world context that the instructor wants them to be able to implement. This was probably the biggest gap that we saw in our study across Ontario, was the lack of attention to training evaluation on the part of instructors. Formalized evaluations using sensible, well thought out rubrics to ensure that the trainees were learning what the instructors wanted them to learn. So that's one way I think that more focus needs to be on the evaluation of training, but also on a larger scale in the way that Tori talked about. the evaluation of training programs more generally and whether they're achieving the long-term outcomes that the organization wants them to achieve, whether that's reductions in use of force, whether that's reductions in officer or subject injuries. We need to ensure that those sorts of evaluations are also being done. Very difficult for police services to do, so I think they need to start engaging with academic institutions and researchers to conduct independent, high-quality evaluations. There's some really good examples now of how these evaluations should be conducted. The best example is definitely the one that Tori mentioned, the ICAT program, ICAT program down in the States, evaluated by Robin Engel and her team at University of Cincinnati. Very well done evaluation, should be a gold standard for how evaluations are done in the future. So there are examples to turn to. Number 8, I think, is the involvement of technology in training. I think Tori mentioned the use of body-worn cameras in a training context. I think that's very valuable. I think it involves crucial information that we can bring into the training room and show officers what good performance and bad performance looks like, provide them with concrete examples, create exercises around and about assessments of that body-worn camera footage. I think the use of VR, especially for smaller services that don't have the sort of infrastructure that some of the larger services do, or for northern or remote communities, or for an organization like the RCMP, where they want to provide standard training to all their officers around the country. But it's very challenging for them to bring officers down from Iqaluit to receive the training. I think VR and other technologies like that, we need to start thinking about how we can incorporate that training into our more standard training programs. And again, General Voix down at Wilfrid Laurier is doing some excellent work on VR training in the area of de-escalation and mental health crisis response. So I can put you in touch with her if you're interested. Second last one, number 9, which is something that we saw across the province, and I think we need to be very concerned about this. And I think it's a result of the hyper-focus that we see now on de-escalation in the news, in police services, and so on. We observed a lot of hesitancy on the part of police officers in training. A lot of hesitancy to use force when force was required. A lot of second guessing as to whether they should do that. Certainly compounding this problem is the sort of hyper surveillance of police officers through cell phones and putting videos on YouTube and cop baiting and all that sort of stuff. But it's a scary thing to see in training when an officer is hesitating to use force because they're worried about what will happen post-incident, when the force is absolutely required and they're putting people's their own and other people's safety at risk by not using it. I think this is this officer hesitancy because of this hyper focus on use de-escalation, use de-escalation, use de-escalation. I think is a very serious issue that instructors across the country need to start looking at. And the last thing I'll say is that obviously I was involved with this organization from the start, and I believe the vision that John, Dave, and other board members have around this creation of either a National Center of Excellence or a Canadian college can be designed to accomplish a lot of what I've just described. Standardized training, for example, dealing with issues around coherence and consistency of training across an officer's career, the establishment of important roles and certifications around curriculum design, for example, enforcing proper evaluations and commissioning studies by academics to do large-scale evaluations of policing programs. I think many of these things are sort of embedded within the vision that this organization has. So I certainly support that, and I think it will have a very positive impact on the nature of policing and police training across the country. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bunnell. That was very informative. I like how you broke it down into the 10 points. There's a couple of questions and comments in the chat that I'm going to get to. I wanted to just jump off with a couple of questions that piqued my interest. For example, you talked about what I wrote down when you were talking was disagreements throughout different police services when you went in the field and you tried to come up with a true meaning behind de-escalation. We see that in not just in de-escalation. There's contrary beliefs throughout the field in multiple different areas. And then I was wondering if as an academic, you thought that perhaps there's a sort of a layperson's view of things, and it may come from it's linked to those different levels of experience and time on the job and different exposure And then those people are then in positions where they're creating or they're teaching and training. So it goes back to both Brian and Tori's, remarks about the proper training and your remarks about the proper trainers. I'm just wondering if those disagreements are sort of founded in the fact that there isn't a lot of educational background in the where the person forms the basis of their understanding. That may be a very technical question, but not to put you on the spot to say, well, no, because I'm an educator, I know more than the practitioner that's out there. But certainly all of us can attest to having those types of challenges when educating others in different fields. So I just want to know if you think that's impactful.
Yeah, I don't know the root cause of the different definitions and conceptualizations of de-escalation. Certainly, my sense was that this was at the service level, but even within a service, a police service, there was disagreements even amongst the instructors there as to what de-escalation was. The key issue was whether use of force can be, incorporated into one's understanding of de-escalation, or whether really de-escalation is about verbal skills without the necessary use of force. It seemed to be driven largely by service level philosophies around those issues that were probably dictated by the training culture within those specific services, rather than any sort of educational component brought to the situation by individual instructors or so on. It just seemed, Peel Regional Police, for example, just had a perspective on that issue that was fundamentally different than the OPP, that was fundamentally different than South Simcoe. And it just seemed to be driven by internal philosophies around those issues within the services themselves and what was trained historically in those services.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that answer, because I think that I had a feeling you would have a similar outlook in that aspect. And then if we extrapolate from that over the national spectrum, you're going to, it's exponential in the challenges you face as far as having a nationwide agreement about a topic, not just a de-escalation, but a topic having to do with police training. So that's one of the greatest challenges for the C-CPR, is to figure out how do we bring the academics with the subject matter experts, with the research and the practical, the members that have the experiences out there, and bring them all together in a forum where we can create, the proper educational forum. So I want to go to Anna. I didn't want to forget Anna's question. She was back in the beginning. She was asking a question that you kind of answered, but maybe just to ask it again. She was trying to figure out about de-escalation training and whether or not it can be deemed ineffective. And I think you made an effort to try to answer that in terms of some of the optics when you were talking about if something was successful, then de-escalation was successful. If the outcome was, basically looking backward from the outcome and deciding whether the de-escalation was palpable. So maybe she's asking about metrics, if there's a way for measuring that.
Yeah, I think it was related to Tori's point. So feel free to jump in, Tori, about, obviously effectiveness and ineffectiveness is determined based on the metrics decided by the evaluators of any particular program. So, use of force, for example, and a reduction in use of force after receiving de-escalation training, a reduction overall within an area is considered a key metric. That one of the primary goals of providing de-escalation to a group of police officers and police service is that over time, in the geographic area covered by them, that there will be less instances of force, and they'll be relying on these de-escalation tactics to a greater degree. So it's when we find that we don't have evidence for those sorts of metrics, then it's deemed, the program is deemed to be ineffective. Now, I'm happy to, I think that there's legitimate debates that can be had around that sort of approach, but that's certainly the approach that is adopted by people doing these evaluations.
Can
Okay.
I just chime in for a second here?
Sorry, go ahead, Anna. I may have misquoted you there.
Yeah, no, not at all, not at all. And it did go back to Tori's presentation. But I'm just curious, I completely agree with what you're saying with the reduction, right? At what point, like what's the threshold? Because we're right now in terms of the number of calls for service, and I work in Winnipeg, So we have probably about, I believe, in the neighborhood of 700,000 calls per service. And one of the metrics and data that we collect is looking at the use of force incidents and reports that are required. And we're under 0.5% of use of force incidents out of that total volume. So I'm curious, is 0 the number or what's?
Yeah, I mean, I can let Tori answer as well. I mean, my personal view on that is that that's one of the roles that community can play. I don't think there is a number, right? I think it's an arbitrary number that has to be decided. Obviously use of force is going to be low to begin with. We know that in Canada, we estimate it to be at about 0.10% of police interactions. That seems to be pretty consistent across the country. So we know that, it's already low. We know that most of those are justified use of force decisions. So there's only so much room to improve. How much improvement is going to be enough to warrant that a success? That's a decision that just has to be made internally. To some extent, it's going to be arbitrary. I think community engagement can be useful around that to sort of try to gauge what is acceptable to communities. The challenge there is, of course, communities don't understand those issues. They don't understand use of force issues. They overestimate the degree to which force is used. They don't understand the legal justification for force. So you sort of definitely open up a range of other issues. But at the end of the day, what is success and what is not success in terms of thresholds, I believe, is an arbitrary decision that you have to try to develop a rationale and be able to defend. Any decrease is useful. Some of it may be cost benefit, and is it a good enough return on your investment through a cost benefit analysis? But yeah, it's a challenging one to know what thresholds should qualify for success and what shouldn't. So I don't know if you have anything, Ori or Brian.
Yeah, I think that's obviously a very, very challenging one because quantifying successful CID obviously is challenging. There's a lot of factors when looking at the outcome of a call. And basically it's not something that you're going to be able to get a hard answer for. Yes, this has been effective. This training has improved or reduced use of force. So that is a very good challenge, a good point that we'll have to kind of approach and figure out whether or not it's worthwhile to do this additional training. I just wanted to pipe in about the ICAT training that Craig mentioned. So for our department, we've also identified that as kind of our go-to structure for additional CID training. So all of our use of force instructors now are sent for ICAT training. A very good program, amazing facility, very welcoming to Canadians, which was nice. And I think that really is kind of the direction forward. And moving forward, we are going to be putting all of our members through a ICAT system. So just a little plug for them there.
And I think as well, Anna, just to add to it. So, looking at the ICAT evaluation, there are three major metrics for reduction in use of force incidents, reduction in citizen injuries, and reduction in officer injuries. I think for me, one of the things is that, there's very rarely any single metric. There's multiple metrics you're trying to affect. And even if the improvements are small, if you can accomplish improvements across a variety of different metrics, even if those improvements are small, I think that can be used to help define success. They found quite significant reduction, 28.1% reduction in use of force and 26.3% reduction in citizen injuries, quite significant, even though the numbers were probably small to begin with. But again, seeing that success across each of the metrics they looked at, even if they were small improvements, I think is one way to sort of look at this issue.
And just to add to that quickly, Craig, I think you can think of success at different levels too. I think those metrics are more systemic level, and sometimes you don't see those reductions. You don't see changes in administrative statistics, but you may see changes at more of a localized level if you're just assessing scenario-based training, for example, improvements in scenario performance after the training's been delivered. So I think you can look at impact at different levels as well. And if you do see the changes on even the smaller scale level, it's still an improvement. So I think you can use multiple levels.
Thank you, for chiming in on that, both Brian and Tori. I like what you said, Tori. It from a police perspective, from someone in the field, it often police services will encourage debriefing of these types of scenarios, especially when force is used effectively or ineffectively, or de-escalation. So the micro version of it is a small group of people meeting and discussing the pros and cons of their interactions. And I think that's very beneficial. In my experience, it's been greatly beneficial, but we see that in your research as well, that academics debrief different scenarios over and over again repeatedly to come up with better outcomes, right? So I think it's a challenge to answer Anna's question, because if you just look statistically, like Dr. Bunnell, when you look at it in the spectrum of statistics, it's such a small number that it's very challenging to come up with the answer. But in terms of each individual situation, if we have a situation where the optics are that we failed in our de-escalation efforts as the police, it only takes one example of a poor failure in the public eye to have a massive impact on our interactions with the community. So I don't know that the number matters necessarily, depending on how, and I don't want to air quote how bad the failure is, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I think, related to the last point, Daffod's point in the chat, I think he's absolutely correct. Each of these metrics is outcome based, right? And it suggests that if you're having a bad outcome, the officer has somehow failed. And we know that officers can do a textbook sort of de-escalation approach. And if the individual wants to hurt himself or hurt other people, oftentimes it's impossible to stop that. So I take the point, Daffod, and I think you're right. And I think a subjective sort of component of the evaluations is important because of those things. We do have to sort of be very careful around these outcome-based metrics for sure.
Thank you. I noticed that Bruce Pitpain has made a couple of comments, and I know Bruce is very actively pays attention to the details in our webinars in the past, and I also he has a vast level of experience with the RCMP in his history. And one of the first comments he made during Brian's presentation was he was talking about the failure of experiences in training that he's had in the past of trainers just basically reading a script and saying, this is what you have to learn, this is what you have to do. And I think that we've challenged ourselves in this webinar to look at that theme of how we present the information, where does the information come from, and how do we know it's valid? And I think we'll all agree that a research lab is going to give us hopefully better validity to the components that we want our police officers in the nation to learn. So I think that just having spoken to him previously and listened to some of his experiences, I understand that it comes from a level of frustration with past training. And I know that Dr. Bunnell, you mentioned the variable that I think any active police officer can attest to, which is I have experienced training where the belief was it should be different than what was taught at the police college. And I'm sure Brian has experienced that in his province as well. And when you go back to your home service, dependent on that culture within your service and the trainers within your service and where they sort of grew up in their histories, you get some bleed over from that. And I know that the RCMP has had some of that in their past as well. Do you see that changing, Dr. Bunnell, with your interactions with the RCMP at the national level because you're in Ottawa?
Specifically around this sort of taking a consistent approach across different phases in officers training. Yeah, I mean, it varied, to be honest, where I saw it least when we were doing our program was in these smaller services where they're able to sort of, it's a more contained environment, right? I mean, you have a service with 86 officers, you have one trainer, You can sort of, the chief and middle management can kind of keep their eyes on that to ensure that everyone's on the same page, moving in the same direction. Where it becomes really problematic, I think, is these larger organizations where you are losing touch with how that training is being delivered, and you have many, many more people. You know, I do training on the coach officer training program in Ottawa Police Service. Each time I go in there, which is every 6 months, there's a new group of 15 coach officers being trained. You have a lot of different cooks in the kitchen then, and it's harder to make sure that everyone's moving in the same direction. So it varied by service and you know, the severity of this inconsistency, but to the degree that services can try to ensure, to the extent possible, that everyone has a common vision and a common set of goals and a common set of standards, I think that would be very useful. And to really try to decrease this sort of view of, forget what you just learned, we're going to teach you how it really is. I mean, that's not helpful, I don't think, to anyone. And it was that explicit in many of the services that we were observing. So I think that's problematic.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that statement, having had interactions with other police services and from different provinces and just having regular conversations about it. So I gather that's one of the impetus behind your support for a Canadian College of Policing, because then at the bare minimum, the structure is there to implement the same messaging to all the provinces, and have, even though each community will have its own independent differences and cultural differences, and you know, different people in different ranges that they're going to have to listen to the input from their communities. The basics that you're talking about, as far as the use of force that Brian talked about, de-escalation techniques, dealing with mental health issues, dealing with drug dependencies and things like that, those are all going to be very similar in most of the communities if you were to sample them throughout the nation, I gather.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I assume, you know, you folks will be better than I to speak to this, but obviously every service is going to have their unique challenges, the, you know, unique community needs and so on and so forth. You certainly don't want to impose a rigid structure that doesn't allow them to, you know, capitalize on training that focuses in these areas. But some level of basic standards and basic goals and basic definitions and basic certifications that many other professions have is pretty critical. And that's what I see a role of this organization as, not imposing such a rigid structure that you have no flexibility or ability to adapt, but some basic fundamental things that we see in other professions. There's real value in that, I think.
Well, thank you for that. Dave Castles has a question.
Actually, it's not a question, but it's something that I really think is important, the purpose of our organization. And I just want to talk about, not all of them, but just the 10 points that Dr. Bonnell talked about. I mean, when you think about it, he talks about current useful information is available, but not accessible to the police. He clearly knows from the Ontario experience in his work, there's no common understanding. How do people learn how to teach? This is critical, learning how to teach. I mean, as you know, Craig, as I know from operational and training experience, that you can follow a PowerPoint, you can follow the duty of care, you can follow all of the things that are important, but one instructor can say something that just literally destroys it all before those police officers hit the street. You said something that's also very important, and that's involved in the community. Look at how many different cultures we have out there and the issues we have, you know, whether it's the Indigenous community or the Black community, that they have no input into what the police is learning. Even if they have some input, that makes a huge difference when it comes to trust. There's complete inconsistency. There's some inconsistency in training in the use of force de-escalation in Ontario. Can imagine what it's like in the rest of the country. Complete inconsistency. And our examination of curricula shows that. Curriculum design, how important that is. Yet it's not, it might be, you know, large departments might have curriculum designers in the RCMP, but many others don't. My point is this: imagine the potential of a National Center for Police Excellence. Nothing that's being imposed, but something that an entity where all of this is pulled together and it's evidence-based and it's available free of charge to either universities or training institutions. The National Center for Police Excellence, and we're moving from the term college, sort of getting away from the concept of oversight more towards excellence, because the National Center for Police Excellence has excessive potential for our country and the police service delivery, and we know it'll take time. But I just want to say, Dr. Benally, your comments in support of what we're doing and your description, and as well as Tori and Brian, about the inconsistencies is so important. And I want to say personally, thank you very much for your comments.
Yes, thank you, sir. I agree. The summary of those points is important, and I want to put it back to any of the people that are been involved in the chat. We still have some time to answer some questions. I've scrolled through, and hopefully I've covered most of our requests. But I'll urge people to, even you can just put up your hand, and we can do it that way if you know how to use the little box with the little raise your hand at the bottom of the screen there. If there's any other questions that we can get, we can try to ask our group some questions and get some answers for you.
I just want to make a quick point in relation to Dave's comment, just to make it clear. I do think personally, and I think the research is clear, and I think my experience doing that previous project is that police instructors, use of force and de-escalation instructors, certainly across Ontario, and my experience across the country, are doing an exceptional job. So I don't want my points to detract from the exceptional job that they're doing. And that's despite the many constraints that they have to operate within. It's not their fault that they don't have adequate time to focus on training these officers. It's not their fault that so on and so forth. So I don't want my comments to be taken that I don't think that they're doing an exceptional job. And every service we went to was exceptional. But it's about how can we move this forward to allow them to do an even better job, and how can we remove some of these constraints. So I just want to make sure that that message is loud and clear. I think they're doing an amazing job, and we need to allow them to do a much better job.
Craig, I agree, and you did say that, and so did Brian, and about that's being delivered across the country. And I didn't want to leave that impression. I was talking about this subject and many other subjects around the importance of standardization, evidence-based, and available, like a gold standard in a particular subject matter that's available. And because there's no entity in our country to draw this together, it isn't in any of the police stakeholder groups, whether it's CACP or the CEPG or the Canadian Police Association or others, there's just no entity to bring this together. And that's why National Center for Police Excellence. And the other thing I want to say, I think the comment came out of the police board member from Winnipeg, and that is, we all know that the majority of incidents that police officers deal with, they deal with it properly. They're dedicated people doing a good job. But there's so much more that can be done to elevate our profession, to improve the profession. And if you think of it, there's 700,000 calls and very few incidents of use of force that has at least been described in Winnipeg. That's very important to know that our police officers are dedicated people. They're committed to their work. They have a very difficult job to do. I know that, Les knows that, and Brian and others that have served in this role know that. But that does not mean that we can't improve like other professions. And I still say, and Craig, again, I am not criticizing in any way the use of force instructors and the delivery method. In fact, you've talked very positively about a couple that could be a gold standard, but there's no way to bring them together. And that's why the center is so important. Thanks very much for your comment, Craig. And Les, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well, Craig. It's challenging to have these conversations and then look back and wonder if we sounded like we were being critical. And I've often had that same fear that we would be seen as being critical of the actions of the police officers that we're discussing. The thing that I look forward to in terms of bringing everybody together is the challenge of listening to all those different ideas. There's a reason why, for example, you mentioned Peel Regional Police right next door to where I work. Many interactions with Peel over the years, as well as Toronto. And they have a slightly different culture than my home service, and Toronto has a different culture, as you're well aware of. Different pockets, they have different backgrounds and different cultures in the way they do things. But think of how important it would be if we could get them all into one room and understand those differences and understand why, you know, Peel, we're not picking on Peel, so just so everybody knows, but they have a Peel-centric way of doing what they do, right? And so do the other police services. My police service has its own, you know, centric way of how it attacks a certain thing. It could just be because of the community, and it's morphed over time from the communities they serve. They've established certain, you know, certain ways of doing things. But it's so important to realize that every one of those interactions where they've developed different ways of dealing with things that are centric to their region could be positive things that other regions could learn from that they don't necessarily know because they don't have those exposures. So if you don't have an Indigenous population that your police service is tending to, think of how important it would be to get exposure from a police service that 90% of what they police is Indigenous, and how impactful it would be for us to learn about those cultural things and how they attack things and how they do things differently. We learned in the previous webinar, the use of force in the Indigenous police services is very low when they are self-policing. That was one of the topics we've discussed previously. So Jennifer Chambers, I know you raised your hand and you wanted to ask a question. I hope we didn't cut you off there, but feel free to ask it or write it in the comments.
Actually, partly covered my point there just now, Les, so thank you for that. I was wondering if in viewing the different approaches that services have to training, whether you thought there's any consistencies in the cultures of services that were more open to change and those who were less open to change, or who only wanted to change in particular directions.
I'll toss that to Craig.
Yeah, my experience was that every service that we worked with had the same motivation to change. We didn't meet any significant resistance. The challenge of changing was certainly different and largely based on size and how sort of nimble they were. But certainly at the instructor level, everyone was open to change and wanted and embraced the project, wanted to learn about best standards, wanted to have access to information about what other services were doing, wanted to learn. So we didn't experience any resistance, but again, it was more challenging in some environments than others.
And
sorry, go
what
ahead.
about what you were mentioning about some services telling them to ignore previous training? That seemed like an inconsistency to me.
Yeah, certainly. Well, that again, that wasn't, I think the issue there is that different sets of instructors feel like they know best, and so that certainly is a concern. And I think, to have an open conversation with the organization about that and to talk explicitly about the potential problems with that isn't happening right now. And to some extent, I don't think people are aware, especially in the larger services, the degree to which that sometimes is happening. I believe that if we sat down and talked about the potential consequences of doing that what I experienced with the services is that there was a culture of trying to learn from that. Now I may be naive, and once we try to implement those changes, maybe they would fall on deaf ears. But I had a very positive experience, and I experienced a real desire to change. But yes, there were some examples of certainly problematic, what I would call training practices that would need to be rectified. But in a very general way, I thought it was very positive.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Jennifer?
I think so.
Okay. Did you have something else, Dave?
No, only to say that as you conclude, Les, Dr. John Lilly has a couple of comments about our coalition, I think, some concluding comments. There's some issues he wanted to talk about. So I leave that up to you and John to work in here. Thank you.
Okay, I'll turn it over to John for comments.
Yes, thanks, Les, and thank you everybody for attending today. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a news update so that you're aware of how the coalition's moving along the pathway towards success. About a year ago at this time, from my memory, we had about 120 members. Now we have 195. So up 60% in a year feels good. Those members are from 10 provinces plus Nunavut. There is a little bit of bad news in this news, and that is that we were turned down for a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant, which was applied by a professor at Mount Royal in Victoria on our behalf. But we'll try again. We'll polish it up. It's a SHIRK Connections grant. And the CRRF, Canadian Race Relations Foundation, that was a big one. I wrote a request for 114,000 and they turned us down too, oh darn it. But there is hope. The hope comes in the form of an application to the McConnell Foundation, written by an expert grant writer named member of our board, Ken Harris. So I think we can be very hopeful about that one. That's for about 50,000, and that is to do something unique that's not happened ever in Canada, which is a formal Indigenous consultancy led engagement with First Nations communities about the knowledge that they feel police recruits should have about their culture, their reality. Once again this year, we're hoping for a summer student, somewhat along the lines of Hannah Steffes' expertise. Hannah's here today, and she's graduating from her Bachelor of Design. And that's what has worked so well for us, her excellent skills at design. The last webinar was about what's holding us back on the professionalization of police. And interestingly, at the end of that, there was really a general call for action. And that call really came from people closely allied with policing profession, active members of either academia, but primarily policing. And they wanted to move to action. And that action is starting to happen in the form of a working group, which will look at the establishment or look at developing a request to the government for a national center of policing excellence. And that is what's leading us to shift away from the call for a college, which is a misunderstood term, to the concept of excellence, which is what a college is all about. But we certainly don't intend bricks and mortar to enable a new institution of learning, but rather all of the supportive work that enables superb education where education happens today. So that sums up our news for the moment. And thank you very much, everyone. Are there closing comments, Dave or Les?
I just have one. I don't want to forget the initiative of former Deputy Chief Mike Federico from Toronto, who really is leading the charge, has taken the lead, has taken ownership of our working group. And I think they'll be working hard for the next, hopefully less than a year, but perhaps a year. And I just want to recognize Mike Federico for taking that initiative. John and I are very busy, so it's taken a chunk off our plate. And I know he's highly motivated to continue, and I'm looking forward to the results of the recommendations, perhaps an actual legislative proposal from the National Working Group. That's the only comments I have, and I would be remiss without thanking Les for moderating this session.